with Technical Writer HQ, and we're going to be taking a deep dive into grant writing, and would love to learn a little bit more about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, I am Jeffrey DiScala. I am a grant writer at the Construction Industry Education Foundation. We're based in Sacramento, but we offer educational programs in California and now Texas. I've been in my position for just over 8 months now. This is my first grant writing job full time, but I come from higher education. So I was a professor for 5 years at an R2 moving into Research 1 institution. And a big part of my work there as well was grant writing. Obviously, that wasn't my number one thing, but if you're going to do research and you need to get it funded, then grant writing is the way to go. At this point in my career, I have about $1.5 million in grant funds under my belt. Most of that are programs that I ran as well. But now I do purely the grant writing, and I get to let other people run the programs and initiatives that I'm writing grants for. So that's
cool.
kind of my background.
Sounds like you learned grant writing through necessity almost.
Absolutely. So as a part of my PhD program, before I became a professor, grant writing, classes, getting to be the essentially co-author on a number of grants, some of which were awarded, some which were not. And then at least one of those continued into, academia, where I kept working on the project. And then, a couple more followed. And it was very much the, if you want to do big projects and have the opportunity to, do research with larger populations, grant funds were absolutely essential. And then when I decided to leave academia, grant writing was one thing that, I had the skills for it and I had the experience. And so I looked for positions in that area to see if it would be interesting, if it would be a route that I could go.
And would love to hear about some of your favorite projects that you worked on during this time, and what were you fighting for?
Absolutely. So when I was a professor, my area of expertise is library and information studies, which you'll notice does not match up with the job that I have now, working in the construction industry space, which is, one of the great things about being a grant writer and having that skill set, is that it's highly transferable to other areas. It's not necessarily industry or sector specific. As a professor in library and information studies, my focus was on school libraries, K-12. And I worked on the Liliad project, which was essentially research and support for school library leaders, largely school district leaders, but also other folks that were just taking charge in the library space. We wrote a series of grants for the Liliad project that brought people together. We created cohorts that essentially brought people that felt isolated in their own districts, because school libraries are essentially a one person per school project. So we wrote grants to bring those folks together, get them to have conversations with one another, get them to take on new projects through professional development, which is a lot of fun. We originally started all of these to, teach some new skills, do some new things. But what we really found was the community building that was the strongest part of it. So we wrote the first grant, which was from the Institute of Museum and Library Services. It was a 3-year grant, just as purely research. We found out that those individuals were really craving professional development, needing community. So our second grant was to do just that, bring those folks together. And then the third grant took what we had essentially had as a core group and expanded upon that, making it a larger group, extending, sort of our reach, and trying to be a more national force to be reckoned with. That was one of my favorite projects in the academic world. Now at CIEF, we focus on working with high school students to get them interested in construction and the trades, architecture and engineering. The one part of the STEM field, essentially. And we do workforce development programs. And so now I'm writing grants that focus on funding school teams that come together for competitions in which, these high school teams build sheds and things like that to get experience. And they're also working for industry professionals. So it's what I've always enjoyed about what I do is that there's always been a focus on education, and I've gotten to approach that from multiple angles, which is really wonderful.
Very cool. And one of the things that I would love to hear more about is this idea of the more grant funds that you get, the more research that you can do. Now, what does that exactly mean? Does that mean more data that you can have to look at? And if you can walk us through maybe some cases that you've worked with, some projects, and depth of what an additional grant fund can really help your organization take to the next level with your projects.
Yeah, absolutely. So at CIEF, we are, the foundation is 18 years old. They've had a grants program for exactly 8 months. So when I showed up, and we've been growing rapidly for the last 5 years or so. We went from an organization of about 200,000 budget in the mid 2010s to now we have a $2.2 million budget. Part of that is because of the grants that we've been able to acquire. When I showed up, largely what they were doing, applying for are what we call transactional grants. It's essentially, you get a piece of paper and it's like, fill out this form, and maybe, we'll give you some money. And it's usually in the range of $2,000 to $10,000. What I really established with them early on was, in order to get anywhere, we have to bring those $10,000 grants up to $50,000 grants, move into the $100,000 grant space in order to get maybe one of those much larger $250,000 to $500,000 competitive federal grants. The key to being able to do that, it's obviously building a portfolio, bringing, just as you said, it's the more you get, the more you get. And in large part, that's obviously being able to show that you're capable of carrying out the projects that you're proposing in your grants. What's beneficial about my nonprofit is that we have established programs that we're just really expanding. So right now we're going for breadth. The way that we do that with grant funding is to track our past history, the number of students we work with, the number of teachers and schools that we work with in our workforce development programs. And since I've come on board, we've started tracking more of that feedback data as well. So what did you think about the program? What did you learn in the or what do you feel that you learned in the program? Next steps for us as we try and move into applying to some of those larger program grants is the more quantitative assessment of, pre and post tests of what did students know before they started our workforce development programs and what do they know afterwards. The next step after that is continuing to collect data in our programs about where our students end up after they finish our programs and after they finish high school. So are the students that we're working with going into trade schools, vocational schools, two-year colleges, four-year colleges, union apprenticeship programs, etc. We're growing that that set of data over time, and with each set, with each part, with each data point that we have, it makes our case that much stronger when we go for those larger and larger grants. So right now, it's great to have the sort of anecdotal data of, Diana and Carlos really enjoyed the program. This is what they had to say about it. Here's a great story where this student, went in further into the field, etc. But we're finding more and more that we're getting asked the question of, okay, what to the whole group? You worked with 1,000 students as a part of this program. What is happening to each of them as we follow through? And so now we're playing the long game of we're just starting to really have that data, and then we can turn that around, write it into our grant proposal narratives, etc., to say, okay, this is our baseline. Now we want to apply for a grant that will extend that, that will grow it even further. We already have a success rate that we think is really promising. Can you help us make that even larger?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, I would feel that for any new organization, this is what they struggle with is that lack of data. And, as for many people watching this interview here, they're looking to get their first job in grant writing. And sometimes they look at new organizations and organizations that have been established for some time. And one of the things you mentioned is your organization has been established for some time. And so there's some data to work with originally. But if you're working from the ground up and trying to get that data in order to make a presentable case, I can imagine it's much, much harder, right? And what would your advice be for people who are looking between those two opportunities of, hey, do I join this sort of new organization where I have to build it from the ground up, or do I join something a little bit more established and I might be able to get more momentum out of the gate?
Um, I think the answer is, I mean, there's not really an answer. Certainly, yeah, there are definitely things that you can look for, watch out for, and be cognizant of. I love where I'm at because while we're an established organization, we were, a $2.2 million budget sounds great, but we're also a nonprofit that has a staff of 8. And that's with 3 new people being hired, 3 new positions this year. And so, yeah, there's some of those data points there, but the folks that are there didn't have any, I don't want to bash them because they're amazing people, but they didn't have any of that real knowledge of what evaluation and assessment looks like. And, you think of grant writing as like this, it's a writing job. But there's also the data collection and evaluation that we're talking about that really fits into it heavily. And so if that's not there, as you said, you're going to be the one starting it. If you're interested in research and data and evaluation, go for it, because it's that's a really amazing opportunity that you get to take advantage of and sculpt in your own way. You have to be aware that there are going to be challenges and pushback because data collection takes time, and you have to make sure others are aware that it's not a if we have time to do it, but this is absolutely necessary for our future prospects, our growth as an organization, our potential to land big money, so that we can do the next new project. You have to show that success. If your focus is more on starting, let's say, new projects, or certainly you're less interested in starting things from scratch, obviously the more established organization is going to be the way to go. And in those instances, you're really looking for and asking about a track record that's already there. When I showed up at my current position, the question was, what have you already done? And they kind of laid out for me what they had already gotten, and they had an amazing track record. They'd gotten something, in the last year, they'd gotten something like 8 of the 10 grants that they applied for, but they were with organizations, foundations that they already had a relationship with. They were for projects that were already ongoing. So it was a relatively simple ask. What they're now finding out as we broaden our scope is that we're not getting as many of the grants as we apply for. And that's, for those that don't have experience with grants, that's a real eye-opening thing. That you have to apply for way more than you're going to get, because it's competitive, isn't necessarily the right word, but selective. I'm answering like 3 questions at once. Sorry about that. But really, when you're looking for that first position, asking an organization what their track record is, and what their experience already is incredibly important. Not only for the data side that we're talking about, but for the cultural aspect and sort of collaborative mentality of, what's going to be needed to go into grant making, and make it successful as well. If they don't have any experience and you're starting a program from scratch, there's a lot of obstacles to overcome there, due to others, and I don't mean this negatively, due to others' ignorance of, all that goes into grant making and how collaborative it is. You don't get to just hire a grant writer and suddenly get grants. That person has to learn about the organization, and everybody has not different answers. There are so many questions in a proposal that are answered by so many different people, that bringing all those folks together can be hard. So understanding what their track record is from multiple angles is super important.
And I'd love to dive into that thought a bit more, because that's one of the main misconceptions that we find that people have who want to learn grant writing is they think of it as a very introverted job where they don't need to communicate with a lot of people. They're like, I want to be a writer, and they're sort of going in with that mentality. And can you talk to us about the collaborative nature as well as building relationships with funders and understanding, hey, if you're going more horizontal with the grants you're applying for, what funder should you be building relationships with? And you only have so much time. So walk us through some of those variables.
Yeah, absolutely. So, um, in as this is, working at CIF, this is my first full-time grant writing position. And so these are things that I have been learning along the way. I wasn't trained as a grants professional. I was trained as a professor that needed to also write grants. And so now being in this space, I was absolutely thinking what you just said. I was like, I'm going to get to write a lot. I'm going to be sitting in my front of my computer. And that's what the job description was too. When I looked at the job description for my position, it was written by, our executive director and our director of youth programs, who wrote grants on the fly when they had extra time. That was their only experience. So I am a grant writer. Technically, I should be a grants manager, because, and the way that changes, your grant writer position is very much that person that is dedicated to doing a lot of the research that goes into, finding applicable organizations and applications where you would be a best fit to apply, doing a lot of the writing, bringing in that evaluation and assessment piece, the reporting aspect, etc. But as you said, and what I'm discovering, well, not discovering, but what I'm really understanding now, is that those connections and those relationships with funders are absolutely crucial. I don't have any hard data to back this up, but in a recent professional development, a very experienced grants professional relayed to us that if you apply for a grant cold, as in you find, the request online, you read the guidelines, you create your proposal, and you submit it without any interaction or contact with the grant banker, you have somewhere between a 5 and 10% chance of getting an award of success. If you get an invitation from a funder or grant maker, establish that connection with a program officer, someone on the foundation board, or an employee at the corporate foundation that is even remotely willing to champion your application in any way, that bumps up to 50%. So from 5% cold to 50% chance of success with a connection is a huge difference. And if you can do that for multiple grants in your portfolio, that's a dramatic increase. And so what seemed like an introverted in front of the computer writing position, as a grants manager, and if you're the only one at your organization that's working on grants, then regardless of your title, you're the grants manager. It's really about relationship building, establishing those connections, sometimes, months in advance, reaching out with very simple questions in an email, asking for, a phone call, something like that, it's a necessity. Unless you're willing to apply for $1 million worth of funding just to get $100,000 worth of funding, then you really have to be, networking as much as you possibly can. And I think that misconception carries through to all of the staff that you work with as well. Their understanding, you have to get others to understand that it's a relationship between you and the funder. It's not a transaction that needs to happen. As far as the other part of your question and what we're talking about in working with your staff, grant writing, grants programs are very much a collaborative effort. Even if you're the only person with assigned duties to grants, I'm at a point now where I ask fewer questions of the rest of my staff when it comes to completing an application, but there are always questions. One of the things that I've learned when starting a new proposal and going through the guidelines is the first thing that I look at and try and determine is the budget for a proposal, because the person that it takes longest to get back to me and the sometimes most difficult things to iron out are with our controller, with our financial person at the organization. She has a lot of other things going on. She never ignores my emails. We have a great relationship, but sometimes there's no funder that asks for a budget in exactly the same way. And unless they ask you to provide a budget, sometimes you have to figure out how yours matches up with theirs, translate it, etc. And that takes the two of us time. And we have a much better working relationships now to get all those things answered. Whereas when I started out, it was, well, I mean, can you not do this? I mean, I thought you were going to be able to, and it's getting others to understand that every part of a grant application requires some collaboration at some point. Now, some of those transactional grants that I talked about earlier, the simple one-pagers or the fill out a relatively simple form, I do those on my own, all the time. I'm thankfully past the point where I'm running everything by my executive director. I no longer need that final review. But we're moving into that space now where the grants are getting more and more complicated. More is being requested of us. And, there are questions or information that is required of us that I have to go to, one of our program managers, our director of youth programs, one of the other folks in the organization that has real knowledge of that aspect. I've had to ask for help with timelines. What are our major goals for this project? Give me, the draft of it, and I'll be the one to iron it out, make it presentable for the application. But I don't know the answer that you want to provide here. And so that collaboration becomes really key. And of course, any type of collaboration requires a lot of advanced planning. And so you learn that starting early is absolutely key. We haven't gone for a federal government grant at this point. And I'm trying to prepare my staff for the fact that, some of the applications that I fill out in a day or I'm working on for a week or something like that, That's not what it's going to be like when it comes to a federal grant, and suddenly we need outside letters of support, or memorandums of understanding with other organizations, really complex budgets and things like that. You have to get started way early. And the CEO who is happy with the work that you're doing is suddenly like, oh, I have to participate now. I don't just get to sit back and watch you do this.
Yeah.
But sorry, I was going to say at the same time, I am one of those introverts that loves to sit and write, but that has become one of my favorite parts of grant writing, is getting to work with others, getting their ideas, getting the many eyes, to improve our applications, and really make them as strong as they can be.
Very cool. Yeah, it seems like you're getting everything very dialed in, and baby steps, right? Baby steps to get to the federal grant level and getting people's buy-in, understanding the process, and then once you're there, people are going to be like, "Okay, we're now ready. This is happening."
Baby steps is absolutely how it's been for us. I went in thinking one thing, and I'm very thankfully moving faster than my executive director thought we would, and that is in part due to my previous experience. But it's also, we're very much on a 2 to 3 to 5 year path, with our grants program. We have an understanding of what we're working on now to get us to something larger 2 years from now, to get us to, all right, we've grown as an organization. We're going for national grants, that will be applied, more broadly to programs. And that's really exciting. And I'm very fortunate to work with some folks that were willing to take a grants program that was very reactionary. We saw, this request for proposals. Let's send something in, to a more proactive approach of, let's attempt to plan out a calendar based on what we've seen before, so we know what's coming. Yes, those other opportunities might come up, but now we're looking, with some foresight to the future, and we can plan around some of our potential funding, as opposed to just trying for what's available.
That makes a lot of sense, and I think a great question just to follow up here is that many of the people watching this interview are taking their first steps into a grant writing position, and if they had to dig down and pick maybe like a few things that could help them get the ball moving, get started with, if they were the first grant writer in an organization, what would that look like? Because you just went through that, and maybe there are some things that you would reorganize, or you'd say, "Hey, I would start on this first." And what advice would you give them?
Um, so I knew this question was. I figured this question was coming, and I tried to kind of think it through. It's simultaneously everything I already said, but trying to narrow that down is difficult. But I think one of the most important things to establish as you're new in a position, once you've gotten past that, sort of honeymoon period, probationary period of just soaking everything in, about your organization or company, and getting to know what they're up to. It's getting the folks around you to understand that grants programs are a long-term game. Unlike fundraising, or product revenue or ticket sales or something like that. Those are kind of, you do the planning, you get the money, and it comes in. The thing that I had to get others to understand is that grant writing, grant applications take time up front. And then depending on the grant, it's anywhere from 3 weeks to 9 months for a response. And so you have to get others to understand that you're looking at a program, a grants program, holistically. It may be about, we need X number of applications totaling X dollars of funding, each quarter. But it's an averaging out to, if we apply for X in quarter one, we may receive Y between quarters 2 and 4. And so we're just repeating that process each quarter to try and, make sure we have a continuous awards of, a certain percentage or something like that. Getting others to understand what that meant, and that we weren't going to start a grants program and suddenly be, just rolling in money within the next 3 months, was something that I really had to focus on. Being in a position, that didn't exist before I arrived. And I think the other part goes back to the piece that we were really talking about at the beginning. That part of, again, grants programs are holistic. It's not just about the application process, but the whole reporting process that goes into it, depending on, the length and the term of the grant. It doesn't matter if they have, 2 questions and a paragraph for you to report back after a program is finished, or an entire final report that requires you to, include 10 pages of very specified information. Funders are going to want you to report back. And so it's that balancing act of spending your time in the application process, and again, that long-term game of finishing things out. And you have to have something to say too. So it's helping your staff understand that we have to collect these type of data to make this happen. I think those are the things that I've been working on the most with my organization and with our staff, in really getting us in a good spot. So not only the program is successful, but our grants program grows as well.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, buy-in is such a crucial part to what you do, and being successful and just creating a great grant writing program. I know we covered a lot here today. Is there anything else that you want to go ahead and give advice to our students about on how to be successful within grant writing?
I think that so I'm in the nonprofit space, and obviously a big part of nonprofits is mission driven. And I think that it's really important to remember that as a grant writer, regardless of your company, nonprofit, organization, etc., grant writing is a very purposeful, mission-driven activity. And one of the most challenging parts is that it's not only, the mission or purpose of your organization, but it's also matching that up with the mission, priorities, and interests of those funders. While that's a challenge, it's also a really exciting part of sorry, I don't want to say exciting. It's a really rewarding part of the grant writing process. And so I always tell myself, and I remind others that when I'm talking to them about grant making, that it's important to keep whatever vision, mission, purpose that you're moving towards in mind. Um, in grant applications, we get very bogged down with these minute details about this and that, especially in technical grant writing. The making sure you've got A, B, C, and D all covered. Um, Make sure you go back to the mission, vision, proposal, etc., to make sure that everything is moving in the direction of meeting that. And it's rewarding because when you're doing that and it all lines up, and then you get that award, it's really exciting because you get to put the rest of your organization in a place where they can succeed in that mission, and that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, we're gonna go ahead and end on that note. I think that's a great note to end on right there. And Jeffrey, I want to thank you so much for being here with us today. And if you want to go ahead and connect with Jeffrey, you can find his LinkedIn profile URL in the description below this video. And that way, if you have any questions, and also if you have any questions, you could just drop them on the comment section of this video, and I'll go ahead and take a look at them later. So again, we'll go ahead and rock and roll from here. And thank you again.
Thank you. It's been